Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri, welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China and the world. This program is co-sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association in New York, brought to you live. Viewers can ask questions by using the chat button on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as time allows. Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, leaders of the two most powerful economies and militaries in the world, met Wednesday, 15 November, in San Francisco for their most consequential meeting in many years. The world has many questions for them, including the future of the $700 billion trading relationship. Will it survive? Communications between the militaries of the two superpowers. With so much riding on the outcome of this meeting, Polaris-Live decided to invite leading experts from China and the US to give our viewers their thoughts about what was accomplished, what was not, and the road ahead. So, to present the view from China, my guest today is Professor Daojiong, the well-known international scholar from Peking University. The American View will be presented at 12 noon Eastern Time today by Bonnie Glaser, Director of the German Marshall Fund's Asia Pacific Center. Professor Daojiong is Professor of International Political Economy in the School of International Studies, Institute South-South Cooperation and Development, Peking University in Beijing, China. Good morning, Professor Daojiong. Welcome back to Polaris Live.
Good evening from Beijing. Nice to be back.
Let's start with an overview of the meeting between the leaders of our two great countries. What do you think was accomplished at this 4-hour meeting in California, and what was not?
I would think it's useful to give us a little bit background about why they are meeting in California, but not another spot at this point of time. APEC probably doesn't mean much of anything for many people. It's Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. It's an annual meeting, and APEC was set up in 1989 at the ministerial level, and then 1993 it was elevated to a leaders summit. The 1993 elevation was also a, should we say, tricky moment in U.S.-China relations. Former U.S. President Clinton's decision to agree to an Australian proposal to elevate APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, from a ministerial meeting to summit was in part to use APEC as a conduit to improve, or for that matter, the 1993 meeting in Seattle summit was very much an excuse to help resolve difficulties between China and the US back then. But today, the function APEC plays for the relationship between the two countries is quite different. Many people have forgotten to pay attention to APEC. Instead, they pay attention to the so-called rivalry between the two countries. That's very useful to bear that in mind. In other words, we might be asking ourselves, were it not for the U.S. term to host APEC this year, would there have been such a meeting in the first place? Or would that meeting capture so much interest? Actually, last year, the two, about at the same time, the two leaders met in Bali, partly because the meeting was not taking place on U.S. soil. Probably there was not that much interest, at least in America. So, before we get to the readout of what you said, I think it's useful to keep that in mind.
Sure, absolutely. And that's also very interesting because the two leaders met in Bali, and the atmosphere and the environment was a lot different than it was here. And Uh, but I mean, at least one point I want to clarify is that the newspapers in America are actually very, very ecstatic about the reception that President Xi Jinping got with the leading CEOs of American companies. So that was one thing that was highlighted here. The other thing that was highlighted, Daojiong, was that for the first time there is a perceptible shift in the dynamics between the two leaders, in the sense that for the first time, at least so the American media says, uh, China's president, needed to get something from the American side, mainly a boost to the China economy. I wonder if you visualize it that way, that it was the first time that this change in dynamic, the China president wanting to get something from the American president, that he needs to rev up his economy. I mean, these two are the perceptions that are being viewed here on the American side. And with that, I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, I've been in conversation with a number of American business executives who have been operating in China or who are conducting major trade events between the two countries. It does seem to me, of course, I can't be that generic about each and every individual I've met, that you American businessmen seem to be in, uh, how should I say, in a double bind. They are concerned about some of the regulatory policies or some of the laws changes here in China. They are worried about the conclusion that China has taken a new approach that is give priority to security over efficiency. So that's one. On the American side, you have uh, now more, let's say, profound questions and very open questions about, toward American businessmen why they are operating in the country or why are they relating in business deals to a country that's defined uh, a rival or adversary of the United States. Um, so especially many would privately speak about apprehension of being subpoenaed by one particular select committee of Congress to answer such questions based on the so-called higher purpose of ideological fight. So against that background, the what you said, aesthetics of the um, Mr. Xi's speech is, to me, was quite a surprise. I think you were referring to the standing ovation he received when he went to the dinner. I guess that's, if there was a standing ovation um, um, when others speak, especially in the American context, would be very normal.
Yes.
Um, but to your second question, um, I don't really know if they quote unquote to get America's help to quote unquote rescue China's economy was on the agenda. I have no insight knowledge at all. But structurally speaking, I would think, for a economy the size and the level of complexity, or in some ways you can say sophistication of the Chinese economy, I would argue that the main solutions have to be found domestic rather than by going to America. The Chinese economy today is different from what it was back in 1993, and certainly what it was uh, back in 1971 when Mr. Deng Xiaoping traveled to the White House to see Jimmy Carter. I'm sorry, 1978, December 1978. So this is not a way of quote unquote Chinese jubilance or triumphalism. It's just that as the economies grow and they're mature, to put it nicely, the level of maturity grows. Solutions have to be fundamentally coming from domestic sources.
Right. That is entirely correct, and I agree with that. But still, if you look at, for example, the Wall Street Journal this morning in America, which, as you know, is our leading business newspaper, the point is very clearly made that China's growth has slowed down, and that foreign direct investment in China has dropped by 20 to 30%, and that for the first time, this meeting brought together the two leaders when China really needs some help to rev up its economy. So that's where I was coming from, and I totally agree with you that ultimately the economy within a country depends on what's happening within the country. But let's move on from there. I just want to stick on the business side for a moment longer, Daojiong. I was talking to the head of a big law firm in America just a couple of days ago, right before the meeting, to sound out, get a feeling for what that community was thinking. And they said, we are very concerned about the intrusion in the business issues in China, that offices, people come into investigation. He said, so we've been withdrawing our staff, and we have a skeleton staff left until we realize what's happening in there. Can you at all talk about this issue of the concern American businesses increasingly have operating in China because of these raids, because of these? Are we exaggerating this? I really need to get you to clarify that for American listeners.
I may not be the best person to quote unquote clarify, because I'm in academia, far away from government, and certainly further away from law enforcement. It does seem to me, given the anecdotes I've heard about these, you have now travel resuming, and there is a return of the Meng Wanzhou moment. The fear of that moment. In other words, the way that case was resolved, you have Americans and some Westerners who have asked me directly as well if China was going to retaliate and may turn them into another Meng Wanzhou, the arrest, either here in China or get China's Belt and Road or whatever partners
right.
to do that. Now, what you talked about is what happened on the ground here in China. Now, each case is specific. I don't have any particular insight, and nor would it be responsible to make any public references to some of the isolated cases. But I would say, structurally, over the years, American investments in China thrived because America was an open society. It hired ethnic Chinese. It hired Chinese, similar to me, who were educated in America, in the West, to do the everyday management here in China. And that's way more prevalent, common than for Europeans or Japanese or Korean companies. So you talk about business executives. I would think there may be a situation whereby some of the so-called raids were carried out due to serious miscommunication between the staff on the ground for American companies and their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and possibly, language is a double-edged thing. When you have Chinese-speaking high-level managers, they can be more effective in communicating some culturally related ideas. But when it comes to issues involving American regulatory policies, for example, sanctions, for example, the export controls, they may not be the best to know they may be having too local for that matter. So I would think historians, business history will look at this and give us a better idea. But my speculation on the so-called raids has to do with, like I said, that may be one factor. I may have got it wrong, but I think for now, my suspicion is that the way the corporate management at the personnel level is staffed here in China for many of the American companies may be a factor. Frankly speaking, I have personal friends who are CEOs on behalf of American companies here in China.
Well, it's really interesting how the perception of people at large is framed by what they read.
But there's one thing here. If you paid attention, they talk about the raids, the rest of executives.
Yes,
You haven't really heard about the name whose last name is American, who is British. Quite possible. You don't have a third Michael.
Yes. No. I fully agree. And you'll forgive me, but I needed to raise the questions that I hear on the street, because not very many people have access to the kind of interview that we're having. And that reminds me, there's a question here which I would like to, from a viewer, that I'd like to pose to you. They say, it seems to me that China is willing to accept a weaker economy in the near term in exchange for the hope of long-term economic independence from the US by diversifying to other parts of the world. Can you comment on his statement?
Very strange. Well, I don't think China is actively pursuing that. It cannot afford to pursue that either. Rhetorically, you have heard a lot, including our president's speech in California. But in terms of practice, in spite of the sanctions, the tariffs, the export controls, the level of export from China to the US continues robustly. And structurally, I would think it doesn't really take a genius for anyone here in China to figure out how and why Mexico so quickly took over China as America's #1 import partner. You look at the size of Mexico, the resources, and the industrial base. So we know our vulnerability.
Yes.
So what you could summarize is more in should we say, analysis of its kind. I don't think we have that option. And even when you look at the so-called retaliations on the American sanctions, the Chinese have not. We cannot afford to do that. Yes. Take that so-called tit-for-tat approach. So decoupling America is not an option.
So, Professor Daojiong, I'm going to revert back to where we started now. What we're reading in the American papers anyway is that the two main things that were accomplished, and by the way, let me preface what I'm saying, that to me, the president of China coming to visit is in and itself a major accomplishment. So I want to preface it's huge to come here, because the way the atmospherics have been framed, is that we are both at daggers drawn, and I know. I mean, to people who are not dealing, but trying to understand it every day, it's almost humorous to think that. But in any case, let me ask you. So the two things that we understand were accomplished at this meeting. Well, one, the help America will get in trying to shut down the precursors of fentanyl. That was a huge issue going into the meeting on the American side. And the other one is reopening communications between the militaries of China and America. there were apparently nobody was even answering phone calls from the other side. Meanwhile, we have ships and airplanes and so on bumping into one another. Those are the two main issues that the media is framing as accomplishment. I wanted to ask you, do you agree with that? And what else do you think we should know about what was accomplished there?
Well, I happen to have been studying the fentanyl issue a little bit, and I can probably spend 3 to 4 hours with you on this. It's quite sad that fentanyl-related issues or illicit opioids-related issues have risen to such a level in both domestic American governance and also in its relationship with foreign countries here, China included. And now, speaking about cooperation in curbing the flows of chemical precursors, products, fentanyl products, and pill pressers, President Biden expressed that very clearly. Those are the three: the chemicals, the product, the finished product, and the tools used for making them, going to the that are supposedly used by drug cartels in Mexico. I can go on and on with this. I would think these issues are not political. If you look at the history of U.S.-China cooperation in counter narcotics, it goes way back to 1983. I don't think thus far you really have a lot of evidence at all whereby we can point to an American request to a Chinese law enforcement authorities with proven evidence and with both sides recognizing that this is illegal. Both sides recognize that's illegal, and then the Chinese side turned that down. I don't think you can point one. Actually, 2019, China sentenced 11, including one on the suspended death sentence of a fentanyl-related case, and that's based on verification and utilization of evidence presented by American side. Sadly, I wouldn't say sadly, but then in May 2020, roughly half a year later, the U.S. side put the Forensic Institute of the Ministry of Public Security, which is at the core of Chinese capacity to track and verify what's going on, evidence, information provided by foreign counterparts, and track down illicit activities in China. The U.S. side put that institute on the sanctions list. So I'm going to be very serious on this. I don't think the American side has a credible case to say, well, the Chinese have not been forthcoming in cooperating with us. We have. Now, we can go on to talk about the relationship between a chemical and the fentanyl or other illicit opiates that cause death, which is very sad. Now, I must emphasize the same can be going on probably with something less deadly or some other substances that are just as addictive here in China. China faces inflow of illicit materials, substances, including, very much like the same, the pressers, the chemicals, the products
right
from abroad. We need American cooperation on this as well. If I can just mention one example, that would be ketamine, right? And we also have the United Nations and the regional mechanisms that are at work. So it would be very, very wrong in the sense of taking life seriously, life anywhere seriously, to treat this as, it has to be an American ask of China. The Chinese are arrogant or they're unsympathetic. It's not factual at all. So I'm glad you raised that. We need to have a honest discussion about it. That, and it's equally wrong for that sentiment to be spreading in some quarters of the U.S., saying that, look, this is, the Chinese revenge on America because China suffered from the Opium War. They would call it the Second Opium War or Reverse Opium War. That sentiment is there, but it shouldn't really be translated into any sort of serious dialogue.
Right. So thank you for that very forthright answer. As you know, Polaris-Live, since we've 2.5 years since it was founded, was dedicated to one issue, and that is to make sure that we bring people like you to talk about what we consider as the most consequential relationship in the world of our time. So I appreciate that answer, but it simply is underscored by the fact that in the American public perception, with all the hearings that are being held, what you've just mentioned that should be a natural occurrence of our relationship is taken as one of the two highlights of what was accomplished. So your explanation is very timely. And let me, as we head into the closing of the half hour, ask you about the other one that is being propagated here in headlines. And that is that the possibility now that American, Chinese military, not just at the strategic level, but down to the operational level, will start to talk with each other again. For rightly or wrongly, the idea here, the perception here is that the militaries don't even answer each other's phone call. And with all the dangers of ships bumping into one another and airplanes, do you see that as a major accomplishment from this meeting?
Yes and no. Yes, in a sense, when you think about the lives of the soldiers on the front lines, both sides, they have families, they have loved ones, they don't want to be turned into POWs or MIAs without a formally declared war. But no, in the sense that we have to ask each other how and why these military maneuvers were taking place so close to one country's border in the first place. Imagine a situation when you have Chinese military actions. I'm not talking about Hawaii or Guam or Aleutian Islands. Let's say Maine. Would you be saying let's have phone calls? Or would you rather say please do keep a distance in the first place?
Good point. And so listen, I
don't know. I may be too straightforward, but I think it's common sense.
Yes. And I would like to actually leave this issue at that, because what you've done is posed it in a very clear light with your question. So let's, as we head into closing here, give you the floor. I'd like to know from you where we started. What do you think was the biggest accomplishment? Where could we have done better? What's the road ahead? I'll let you just give your thoughts on it, which will be very important at this point here.
I would think the biggest accomplishment is probably not what was reiterated by the two leaders and their negotiation teams at this particular formal meeting. I think the biggest accomplishment it was led up to the event, for example, the reopening of travel, the increase of flights, and I haven't really seen details, but I do. It won't be surprising for both sides to ease some of the requirements for getting visas. It would be, and also, I'm an educator, and I do believe people can learn, educate themselves by being in another society on a daily basis. I would hope the resumption of human-to-human contacts at a societal level will lead to more students and ordinary tourists coming here to China, and certainly more Chinese going to America and make a judgment about the situation. Partly with COVID, partly with politics, But now, what most encouraging change to me is the resumption of societal level contacts.
Well, thank you very much for that, Professor Daojiong from Peking University. I fortunately still have 6 years left to go in my multiple entry visa to China, which I hope to take advantage of soon. But we have run out of time. So on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association in New York and Polaris-Live, thank you very much for your time. I will apologize again for the mix-up in the daylight savings time and so on that we had on this. I do hope you will come back and see us again. Many, many thanks.
Thank you very much. As you said, this is an important topic and an important time, and it's where was the inconvenience to stay up a little late into the evening. Thank you very much.
Be well. Thank you. And to the rest our viewers from around the world, we were with Professor Daojiong from Peking University talking about the recent meeting in San Francisco between President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping of China. Until we see you, hopefully 3 hours from now, when Bonnie Glaser, the director of the Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C.'s Asia Pacific office, she will offer the American side of this dialogue. Until then, goodbye.